Hi, what are you doing here? Oh, you come for the lecture? Yeah, I've got it here. The Long History of Time, the Geological Past and Future of Earth. Oh, don't worry, it's only GCSE level physics, it's nothing challenging. Okay, see you later.
Start by admitting from cradle to tomb, it isn't that long a stay. When I go, I'm going like Elsie.
Think about your long life and think how your parents gave you a brother or brothers or didn't. But if they did, think about how in the beginning you fought endlessly, both verbally and physically, to the utter despair of both your parents for years and years and years. But not forever. Think about how you slowly worked up a truce and how you watched each other. Maybe you drifted apart for a while, but also drifted together at times. Think about how you chose your colleagues and friends. How maybe those early years ended up benefiting you for later life. Think about how those friendships changed and grew over the decades of later life. You always had a brother, or didn't. That's just how it is. You don't need to think about it. But think about it now. What if you hadn't had your brother? What if none of us had any brothers? What if we were all alone? Is a stream the best metaphor for talking about time? A stream or a river? I'd like to talk to you about time. I'd like to talk to you about the physics of time. A stream or river may be the best metaphor to start with, but it's certainly not the only one. When I was writing an essay about the shape of the universe, I wanted to talk about time, and I came up with the analogy of a tree as being the most useful metaphor for me to talk about the physics of time. Now, I need to work up to that here. So that's the end goal, but on the way we're going to build up to that by looking at other possible metaphors for time. For example, I was very struck when I came to look at the ancient history of the Earth by the fact that it breaks down very neatly into periods. So the first 500 million years of our existence, we were just a ball of magma, a ball of lava. The next billion years was the genesis of life on Earth. The next billion years was the conversion to an atmosphere, not a breathable atmosphere, but an atmosphere nonetheless. The next billion years, from 2 billion BC to 1 billion BC, was the continents, so land, not just a ball of water. And then the final billion years was when things got fruity, particularly in the latter stages, because of sex, and eventually through DNA, us. So it's a neat way to grasp an unthinkably large amount of time. It may lead on to further questions, or it may prove a useful framework which itself answers the important questions. And that's the fun of it. So my reason for making a video was primarily to inform and entertain myself. There's a lot of ground to cover to get to where I want to go, which is to use the metaphor of a tree to talk about the physics of time. It's ground that is worth covering well, which is why it's a long-ish video. And at times I will digress. I will digress to expand on points. Now that may be appropriate and of interest at the time, or it may not, and you may wish to fast forward, which of course you can do because you can always come back to it later. So when I feel I'm looking to expand or digress, then I'll treat myself to a seat, and so that we can see that the digression is ongoing, and come back to the main subject and discussion in due course. So time as a stream or river works well in the simpler cases. I'd like to be a bit more ambitious in the less simple cases. So I'll start off, when I'm looking back through the past, I'll start off with the stream or river approach. But what I'll do is I'll look for the key points on the timeline, and I'll see if it's possible to pick out key points on the timeline in the more complicated recent history, just like it is for the less complicated, less explored past history. If I can do that, then what I'll do is I'll try and develop multiple streams. So here I've got 6 subjects. I've got a period from 1000 AD to 2000 AD, broken up into regular intervals, and I'm trying to pick out the key. I'm trying to see if I can pick out, based on my knowledge, based on my common sense, the key items or my key items in the list. If I can do that for the recent past, I might be able to do it for the recent future. So I've got from 2000 to 3000, and I'm trying to do an equivalent thing. Originally, I was hoping to get a bit more ambitious and do the same thing, but from 3000 to 15,000. But I found that my imagination just wasn't up to the job. So I've had to fall back to something that's slightly easier and do a similar timeline idea rather than a load of rivers into the sea, from 3,000 to 15,000. Once we've done that, we can come on to develop the tree metaphor and look into the far future. That's the plan. We would start this journey not with a simple understanding of time, but with a simple understanding of the lack of time. So we would make the effort to imagine, what if there was no time? What if time was completely unimportant to us, instead of at the moment the most important thing? Well, the first thing we observe is that time was important to early communities of humanity because of the seasons. So what's important is summer, spring, autumn, winter, and it's striking that we perceive the megalithic cultures in these terms, their grasp of time in the form of the seasons. That was a long time ago, coming a bit closer to modern times. Then, prior to the invention of the watch, it would be the ringing of the bell that would signify the importance of the time period. And monasteries, as you probably know, the Latin names of Vespers and so forth are for those 2-hour time periods that they broke the working day into. So people would, they didn't have a watch, they didn't know what time it was to the minute, but they would synchronise with each other through this business of the monasteries. But if you didn't have a watch, what are the circumstances under which you wouldn't even consider the lack of it? If we take the example of Robinson Crusoe, shipwrecked on a desert island, having to survive on his own wits, his own ingenuity, his own inner resources, there's a person, you could argue, who has no value, no benefit from a timepiece. It would only be a reminder of what he did not have and could not have. Better to learn an understanding of reading the sun and reading the sun, the signs of the seasons, and the signs of his immediate environment to make him feel at home. How far back can we go? Well, now that's an interesting physics question. We can go back, supposedly, to the beginning of the Big Bang, supposedly 13.5 billion years ago. Only one trouble with that. The universe is wider than it is old. So how has it managed to, how is it that there are parts of the universe which are not connected by time? Let's move on to making a sense of near history. You could do this for any period. So what I want to do is I want to take a point in the last 100 years as my starting point. Somewhere that I feel is, I could take now, but because I'm involved in now, that's not an ideal choice for me. I'd rather take in the last 100 years, I'd rather take a more objective point of view. So I'm going to look for a time when I'm not, which is not part of my own short lifetime in the last 100 years. It could be any time at all. But what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and then go back century by century and look at that particular year in that century and basically say what was coming and what was behind it, what was in front of it, so that I build up like a picture of 1,000 years. If I can do that for a single timeline, then perhaps I can do it for multiple timelines in the sense of rivers flowing into a sea of time, which would be my preferred outcome. So let's see what we've got. It's easier the nearer we are to now. So I chose 1940 as my archetypal year in the 20th century. It's not yet 2040. That's enough in the future to be hard to envisage. So that's well within the target time. So I'm then going to go 1840, 1740, and so on. Obviously, in 1940, the defining, not necessarily obviously, but for me, the absolute defining characteristic of that year was the Second World War, particularly from a British point of view, that was in a way Churchill's defining year. That was the point at which that was Churchill's finest hour. We then go back 100 years. We go back to 1840. And in 1840, well, that was really notable to me for the establishment of English literature as an adult entertainment, and the archetypal representative of that was, for me, again, Jane Austen. And having studied Jane Austen for literature A level, I feel I have a picture of what life was like for an ordinary person in 1840 through Jane Austen's work. 1740, we're still well within the Industrial Revolution, so it's still fairly graspable. We've got Nelson, we've got Napoleon, and again, these are well within studied historical memory. So 1640, we're getting a little bit more opaque. We've got Charles I on the throne. Obviously, torrid times, difficult to imagine for the layperson. The English Civil War, Roundheads and Cavaliers, it was a complicated time, which it's hard to envisage fully what ordinary life was like. It was the height not of the navy, but of shipping and trade. So the East India Company and piracy and the slave trade were all absolutely iconic of this period, 1640. Drop back another 100 years, 1540. Well, now we're starting to get much earlier on in the history of writing. So we've got Shakespeare. We've got Henry VIII, again, a very well-studied aspect of that period of time. And we've got, of course, the sinking of the Mary Rose. 1440. We're now back right at the beginning of the Renaissance. We've got the Wars of the Roses, Louis XI on the throne in France, and we've got Leonardo da Vinci to come. So a bright period in history. 1340, getting slightly darker, we've got pilgrimage as being a defining characteristic, with Chaucer and the Black Death and the 100 Years' War going on between England and France. 1240, now it gets a bit more difficult. However, we do have the Magna Carta, which, if you're English, is very graspable. We have the establishment of Oxford University, and we have, on the physics and science front, we have Roger Bacon as the person who made his mark in both alchemy and physics, and would have been a reasonable precursor to Newton, who was similarly an alchemist and, of course, the father of physics. Roger Bacon discovered gunpowder and ground his own lenses, so optics. Chemistry and optics, it's absolutely a precursor to Newton's most important work in 1240. Remarkable. And then in 1140, we've got chivalry. We've got the Second Crusade, Saladin defending Jerusalem, and we've got the Knights Templar, famously, the subject of endless conspiracy theories. finally, when we reach 1040, then we really are on the cusp of the changeover from the second 1,000 years to the first 1,000 years. So the most notable previous event was really the invasion of the Vikings. The next most noticeable thing after 1040 is, of course, the Norman conquest, 1066, and all that, as it famously is. And what's so interesting about that is not just the Doomsday Book, the point at which England becomes a nation, but also the introduction by the Normans of the fortified holding, the fortified area, because that really was the beginning of the great era of castles, which was going to last really pretty much for the next 500 years. So 1066 and all that, I remember reading a long time ago the book 1066 and all that, and I remember trying to start reading Bill Bryson's much more recent A Short History of Nearly Everything. So one is looking for a framework on which to hang an understanding, or not just an understanding, but an ability to understand new things. So, for example, I was listening to a book review of romantic fiction, and it was talking about people that I remember seeing the names of and never really knowing quite what they were, because they were never personally related to me. So Georgette Heyer was the person mentioned in the book review as having written these immensely entertaining novels, romance novels admittedly, but nevertheless funny and true, about the Regency period. And there was much talk of the Regency period. Oh, it was just on the edge of the Regency period, and then it was truly right in the Regency period. And one thought, what the heck is the Regency period? These are not things I can pluck out of my general knowledge. Maybe I'm less well informed than others. But what a framework does is it gives us the opportunity to ask a very simple question: when was the Regency period in relation to my 40s breakdown of the last 1,000 years? And that sort of thing is memorable in a way that straight dates is hard to remember. So useful things. But I'm not going to, I didn't manage to read A Short History of Nearly Everything. The book I did read, and I'm glad I did, was The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Gibbon's a condensed version of Gibbon's historical work. And that was a very deep read. I wouldn't say it gave me a strong framework of understanding, because it didn't, because it was too dense. And that's really why I don't favour a book approach to getting a good understanding. So I've got to say, it's a neat, pleasing, maybe horribly opinionated, but for the purpose, successful attempt to just make a robust framework on which one can hang a curiosity, an ad hoc knowledge, and go forward. So that's a success, and it gives us the ability to move on, to push our luck, because okay, we've got markers, we've got a meandering line, but have we got a rounded picture? Let's see if we can test it, and let's see if we can develop just that. if I don't favour a framework approach to getting a good understanding, what is the next step? How can we build on this, what I think of as success? Well, we've accepted the stream metaphor for time. Can we multiply that? Multiple streams and rivers flow into a sea. Can we have a metaphor of the sea of time? Well, if we did want to do something like that, I suggest it might look a little bit like this. So one would identify, as far as possible, no reason not to do it initially on the basis of preference, because there is no precedent, so one can feel free to set one's own precedent. So 6 factors: the frontier, clothing, transport, war, the spiritual side of humanity, and taste. I want to look at each of these elements as being its own stream, as having its own stream of progress. And what I want to ask is, can we identify events across this time period which overshadow the other events, so that one almost has a metaphor of waves on the surface of a sea. And that's what I've set out to see if it would work if I did do that. And that's what I want to talk about next. Very quickly then, starting off, my first overshadowing event is in 2000, so more or less the present day. And what I've got there is I've got taste, because I myself have made some 8 hours of videos so far, outlining a theory of taste as opposed to assuming that everybody has the same sense of taste, just as everybody has their own sense of what they like musically within the overall shared sense of what is good musically. It seems to me that what we have not fully grasped is that we have our own sense of what we like taste-wise within what is generally accepted taste-wise, and we're in the exceptional position in 2000, which we've never been in before in the whole history of the world, where, thanks to our global trading links, we really have the full magnificence of Earth's produce from which to choose what to eat. And that's both a challenge and an opportunity. And it's a challenge because the big risk is overeating. If we go back to 1750, right at the birth of the Industrial Revolution, then again, in my opinion, but I think with a reasonable basis, I would say that clothing was the thing that overshadows all the other changes that were going on at that time in the other different areas, because I would say the common ordinary person having access to cheap mass-produced clothing was really a revolution in convenience and opportunity for ordinary people. Prior to that, I think that clothing options were limited, but subsequent to that, then really we were on the path to modern clothing. go back to 1500, I've got the spiritual aspect of our nature as being the overriding influence on that era. But unfortunately, that's a negative, not a positive. For me, the period from about 1400 to about 1800 was the period when witchcraft and witch trials was generally manifested, and I think that's a particularly brutal and ignorant, unfortunately, period in our history. Prior to 1400 was the great era of chivalry, and I think that was a high point in terms of spirituality. I think that we are below that high point in modern times with our attitude to with our choice of sex over love. I think we're not at our best even at the moment. Whereas I think in the age of chivalry, I think that was a shining highlight in our history of the last 1,000 years. But the downside, the corollary, is the witchcraft era, which unfortunately overshadows chivalry in terms of length and depth. Going back another 250 years to 1250, we've got, and I've got to remind myself why we've got this. Actually, we've got the peak of castle building. So this was really before cities began to really take off and become successful. Following the Norman invasion, we had realised the strength of fortified strongholds, and we'd started to build them. Those were quickly developed into castles, and then there was a battle. There was a struggle between fortifying the castle to make it invulnerable and therefore an unassailable seat of power, and building and developing the technology to equip the army to destroy the castle and therefore make the army the tool of empire. And it was a battle that lasted, that took place over hundreds of years, with many technical improvements on both sides as it went on. And eventually the castle did get abandoned and people did move to the cities and start to organise politically rather than feudally. Finally, going all the way back to 1000 BC, and you may notice, by the way, that there is no circle, there is no overriding event for war. And that's really because war, the most striking thing about looking at the last 1,000 years as a whole, to me when I did this, was that war is an absolutely constant factor throughout that 1,000 years. You might be tempted, I might have been tempted, to put the First World War as an overriding event, because that was arguably the purest hell of industrial warfare. But that doesn't square with the facts in my perception, because there was no period where there was not war being brutally waged throughout this time frame. So it's a major factor in the development of armour, in the development of politics, in the development of trade. You cannot not have it, but I don't think there is any one overriding event and that's why I've left it blank at present. So if I go all the way back to 1000, then the last most overriding event of all of these, of all of these factors, is actually in the area of transport, because 500 years earlier the Romans had left behind a network of roads covering the whole of England. Now initially those roads weren't used by the people after the invasion because they didn't want to be reminded of the Romans. They didn't want to benefit from what the Romans had done. However, that network of roads obviously proved invaluable to the Norman conquest, and in fact proved invaluable as we did start to make use of it, because we realised we couldn't not, proved invaluable for the next 800 years. So 1300 years after those roads were first built, some of them, they were still the main thoroughfare for English people. It was only 1800 when we organised ourselves politically to create a ministry, the equivalent of a ministry, for managing the road system. In my way of thinking, in my understanding, that's a fascinating picture of, metaphorically speaking, the sea of time over the last 1000 years. And encouraged by the success of doing that, we can come on and try and do something similar for the next 2000 years. Before taking on the next 2000 years as a whole, I'm curious as to the immediate present. I'm curious as to it's 2017 now, so in the period 2000 to 2020, from 2000 to 2020, what are the factors that leap out as being germane in terms of looking ahead, in terms of the timelines? So I would say for transport, we now have not just cars, planes and ships, we have drones and an explosion in the use of drones. We have movement out into space in terms of the ISS, so we're pushing forward on the frontier of cities. We have an ongoing expansion in the music industry and an ongoing expansion in the availability of music. We have a huge reduction in the cost of power thanks to other alternative sources of it. So particularly solar power has been a huge growth industry in the last 17 years, in the period 2000 to 2020. We have trends going on in terms of work, and we have the main event for me, which of course is the food element of design. So if I'm going to do this for the next 1000 years, I'm going to try and create a picture of the next 1000 years in the same way. What categories am I going to choose? Well, clearly the challenge is to use the same categories. So for instance, frontier, which was for 1000 years the edge of empire and the centre of empire. So prior, 2000 years ago, the key city was Rome, the key empire was the Roman Empire, and the key frontier was the edge of the Roman Empire. Over the last 1000 years, well, in 1000 BC, Cordoba was recognised to be the most successful and sophisticated city of its day in Spain. Halfway through the century, it would have been the Italian cities during the Renaissance. At the end of the 1000 years, in 2000, in the 20th century. Initially, it would have been unquestionably Berlin, but then once Europe descended into civil war, almost certainly New York. So the frontier moves, and as we go into the global era, it moves obviously into space. So we've got citizen space as the frontier for the next 1,000 years. We've got clothes and wearables as the frontier for the next 1,000 years, not as the frontier, as one of the streams flowing into the sea of time over the next 1,000 years. We've got transport and robotics. We've got war and politics, the continuation of war by other means. We've got religion and economics as the continuation of our development of our spirituality and the challenge to it. And we've got, as taste, we've got food, but also we've got design. So not just fashion, but actual good design for the next 1,000 years will be a major aspect of our development. So straightforward enough to come up with the categories. Now, what about the events? What about trying to predict what the events might be? Well, it's easiest to start from where we are and go forward, just as it was easiest to start from where we are and go backward. So the very first thing I'm going to identify as being an overwhelming factor in modern time, in the current time, is in religion and economics, where we have in some ways the last great religion, which is of course Islam. So Islam, which prohibits drinking, which prohibits money lending, which worships regularly, which has unquestionably downsides, but not necessarily, but optionally. So what people tell you is part of Islam is not necessarily what really is part of Islam. Controversial, but discussable. Moving forward to 2250. I've got the first trillionaire. Now there are people saying the first trillionaire will happen in, if not my lifetime, then certainly in a young person's lifetime. I think that there will be numerous financial crashes between now and 2250, and I think it will take a long time before we get to the point where we will get to the point where we have trillionaires, but it'll be a while, and I don't think that's any bad thing. So that's not so contentious, although other people might not agree. In 2500, I've got two candidates for my prediction. The first is the creation of a library of things. So this really is the point at which consumerism, this is a development in design, effectively, because there's no technology needed to have a library of things. It's just purely a choice to start to have it. But really it's a key choice because it's the beginning of the end of consumerism as the driver of trade worldwide. Once you no longer accept people buying individual copies of everything, then you've got a new situation. 2500, then we have two overshadowing incidents, equally important. We have the political act of a country giving up its language. So there's a bit of pressure on countries economically not to suffer from having a foreign language with all the overhead that having your own internal language for historical reasons creates. And there's also a bit of pressure from outside as well for countries to set a lead in being willing to in being selfless and unselfish enough, unselfish, and being willing to put to one side their political heritage in order to benefit in the future. So my suggested lead is set here by the country of Germany, which volunteers to put aside the German language and embrace, well, I don't think it's going to be Cantonese, which it will embrace, so I think it's likely to be English if a country does that. So in 2500, my prediction is that Germany will put aside its language in favour of English from then forward. In 2750, we have a breakthrough in terms of clothes and wearables, because we have 3D printing becoming the basis of clothing manufacture instead of any other way. So it's the main way of getting clothes is to 3D print them yourself, which means that people have the opportunity to customize their own designs, but it also means that people are printing and wearing clothes which are literally of the moment. So that's as big a breakthrough as the Industrial Revolution originally was 1,000 years later. And then finally in 3000, in the conjunction of the frontiers of city and space, we have the most significant event of the entire millennium, which is the establishment on the moon of the town New Olympus. It may have a population of 0 because it may be populated entirely by robots at that point, that early in time, but if so, it has a thriving tourist industry. So easy to make bold predictions with no responsibility, let one's imagination run wild. And so it's not surprising that that's an achievable thing to do. What's more difficult is to push on further and say, well, we found it relatively easy to identify events going back 100 years, 100 years, 100 years, for 1,000 years. What about going forward? And I've said that originally I was hoping to do what I've just done for 1,000 years for the period from 3,000 to 15,000, but I just found that my imagination wasn't up to the task. But what I have done to challenge myself is to do the same going forward as I did going backward, which is very quickly to go from 3,000 to 15,000 in terms of looking ahead. So in the period 3,000 to 4,000, the most significant event I've got is the dying off of animals, unfortunately. So we're going to see the effect of intensive farming, high population, and global warming, and we're going to see this die off in the animal population as a result of the delicate chains that have been established beginning to break down. We'll also see a new art form, completely brand new art form, in the form of 3D sound, a designed sound environment, which headphones and high quality sound systems will make possible. So that'll be a new art form. And we'll see, unfortunately, the continuation of wars as a result of economic difficulties. In the period in the next 1,000 years, from 4,000 to 5,000, the animal die-off is going to continue. The effects of that are going to continue to be felt. There will also be a much more widespread control of and eventual ban on alcohol, as people realise that and come to fully understand that as a drug, alcohol is really a bit too strong to be something that is widely used, and the effects are deleterious on the individual as well as on society as a whole. So there will be a growing move to ban alcohol and to replace it with milder, softer drugs. And there will be the continuation of wars in those areas which have huge economic uncertainty. From 5,000 onwards, what we start to see happening is a drop in the population as people begin to think over a much longer time span, not just in terms of what's happened in the past thousands of years, but also as a result of beginning to look forward and understand a much longer time frame of the future. Then what we will see much less immediacy in terms of people wanting to hang on to life at all costs, however unpleasant it may be for short periods. So we'll see a natural population drop. We'll see a much greater focus on where the frontier is. So as we've moved into space and we've got cities in space, it'll be those areas which are the focus of the glamour and the hope and the interest for most people. So they'll be the stars of the future. And we'll see also a growing lack of work. So we'll see a growing lack of standard work roles being available to people. The roles of designer, of doctor, of architect, of lawyer will begin to fall away as there is a growing lack of need for them to be practiced on a full-time basis by individuals on a large scale. And that's really the continuation for the next 2,500 years. So in 7,500, we've reached the point where we have a much lower population worldwide for an extended period. We'll see a complete end to personal transport on a large scale. It'll be group transport on the wider scale for everybody. We'll see the beginning of some underground living as areas get scoured by hurricanes and high temperatures and become non-viable on the surface, but very much viable underground, because that's what we need to do to live to live in space anyway. And obviously that will create jobs of a certain type, but again, because of the breakdown in the role-based in the traditional role-based way of working, it will be differently. It'll be organised on a different basis than we're used to now. That'll continue up till 10,000. So in the year 10,000, we still have a very low population. We have worrying trends like a rise in organised crime. We have a spiritual low point in our growth and development as a species as we start to see this crime as we start to see organised crime take over in place of normal methods of earning a wage through work. And we'll see an explanation of something that at the moment seems completely mysterious and completely without any sensible explanation of any kind. We'll see crop circles begin to become an understood phenomenon. That'll continue to 12,500. So in the year 12,500, in the century 12,500, we will really see the end of work as a separation from play and rest completely. So work and play will become combined. There'll be no relevant difference between them, and there'll be new words and new areas identified. We'll see, and this is really the point at which the biblical prophecy starts to come true, and we start to see the meek inheriting the earth. So the traditional aggressive male money-based or territory-based or power-based model will really start to fall away. There will be no place for that. Aggression will be completely channeled through sport and the arts. So there'll be no reward for excessive aggression. There'll be no in a entirely community-based global society. It'll be the ability to get on with people and to think long term and to behave long term, which will be the things that are valued, and thus the people who are meek will be the ones who will want that world, because not everybody would want to live in that kind of world, but also the people who thrive, who benefit from that world. So that's the future, and that will continue into 15,000. So by the time we get to the year 15,000, we finally end up with a proper world government, which is as powerful as national governments, and that's really where the adulthood of the human race begins. So prior to that, we've been the equivalent of adolescents playing in the playground. Now we're becoming a serious spacefaring contender. It's a world government, but it's an ultra-conservative world government from anybody living now's point of view. Very, very resistant to change, very, very resistant to anything that hasn't been tried and tested and proven, is my thinking. There will be a contrary movement against that, which will obviously be based on freedom, just as it has been all this time, but it's two irreconcilables. So there won't be anything new about that conflict. It'll be something that we've seen that we're very familiar with and have seen all sides of, in my opinion. So that's a quick run through from 3,000 to 15,000 in my way of thinking, in my mind. And it's interesting because just the fact that it's possible to come up with a plausible view of such a long time frame is a reward, a challenge, an opportunity, a problem to people who wouldn't bother to do that, don't think it's important, don't care about it, and wouldn't want us to do it. Those who do this kind of thing for the fun of it, for the joy of it, for the thrill and for the challenge in its own right, are ahead of the game in one way of thinking about it. We come now to, in many ways, the purpose of what we've been doing so far. We've looked at time as a sea, and we've seen how time would be seen as a metaphor in terms of a sea, both in the last 1,000 years, in the next 1,000 years, and beyond, and previously. That's in what might be called arithmetic time, because those numbers increase linearly, 1, 2, 3, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and so on and so forth. But that's not the challenge when you're dealing with time as a whole. The challenge when you're dealing with, in fact, it's impossible to deal with time as a whole, as we'll see. But the next challenge is to deal with just the time that we know about, just the time that we're certain of. We are absolutely certain that the Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years and will be around for another 4 billion years before the sun turns into a red dwarf and swallows the planets of the solar system. That's the time period where the challenge really lies. So how can we possibly grasp that magnitude of time? We've got up to 15,000 years, and we're not talking about, when we're talking geologically, we're not talking about 15,000 years, we're not talking about 15 million years, we're talking about 1 billion years. It's an unthinkably vast amount of time. But I believe that the only credible assumption is the assumption that life is designed to continue the way it is now for that period of time. That's why all this effort has gone into where we are now. It may seem inconceivable or ridiculous to suggest that we're going to have children and procreate and just keep on living for 1 billion years. It may seem absolutely unimaginable, but I think that's a failure of the framework. I think if you get the right framework, I don't think that is unimaginable. So I want to suggest a framework that we can use. Before I do, there's a couple of assumptions. One of the assumptions is there's no such thing as faster than light travel. So we're never going to be zipping around the universe, exploring planet after planet after planet, and getting there instantly. and all be one big lump. That's not going to happen, because faster than light travel is always going to be impossible. That's the assumption I'm working on. Now, what that means is that it's going to be incredibly difficult to get anywhere. And in fact, the only places that we can really look to go are going to be within our galaxy. A bit like people living in Reading or Birmingham or Liverpool. Those people are going to want to meet each other not by going to where they live, but by going to the capital, London, somewhere that's halfway, somewhere that's big enough and obvious enough and halfway enough that both people want to go there. Well, it's a bit the same with us. We're right on the edge of the Milky Way galaxy. Nobody's going to come out to see us. There's absolutely no reward for them to make all that effort when you can't go faster than light, and it's horribly difficult. Everybody is going to want to go inward to where the action is at the centre of the galaxy, because everybody is going to come to the same conclusion that we have, which is that this is not a return journey. This is a pilgrimage. Some of us will go out, but anybody who goes out isn't coming back, because there's no way to do that. You're going to have to go out and you're going to have to stay out. So it'll be like links in a chain, not Star Trek. So that's the key assumption. Now, that's the key assumption in terms of physics. The secondary assumption in terms of physics is to do with entanglement. So particle entanglement means that however far apart two quantum particles are, they are mirrors of each other. I believe there's a reason for that, which I believe is to do with the shape of the universe, but I also believe that there's a point to that, and I believe the point of that is communication. So I think that even though people will be going out on a pilgrimage, I think there will be instantaneous communication. I mean, I think it'll be limited. I don't think it'll be whatever you want to say, whenever you want to say it instantly. I think there will be a capability for instantaneous transmission, which will have to be managed carefully in order to work. So a bit like now, if your son goes abroad, you want to Skype them. Well, you can do that, but you can't. It wouldn't be appropriate. You could. It wouldn't be appropriate. You could rig up a Skype connection that was permanently on. You could do that, but you wouldn't. So what you would do is vastly inferior to that. I mean, a Skype once a month is not anywhere near as good as being able to turn around, because you're permanently connected, and say hi and have a chat. So these are the two big assumptions that I'm making about this geological period of time. There's a third hidden assumption, which is that I can imagine 1,000 years. I can even, if I really stretch it, imagine 1,000 years. Just about. What I can't do is I can't imagine 1,000 years. I can't imagine 1 billion years. So my implicit assumption is that getting to the centre of the galaxy is so difficult, it needs all of us. So this is the big appeal, really, of ruling out faster than light travel. It means that the human race, or indeed the alien races, are not going to be dependent on a second or third Einstein coming along and inventing this mega physics that nobody else understands that allows us to go faster than light. That's not an appealing scenario where everything depends on this one super person. In my opinion, that's not an appealing scenario. A far more appealing scenario is where actually being able to do that depends on the meekest, least significant person, because at the key point they step in and they say, oh, this is how you do that. And it may be physics, but far more likely, far more appealing is that it may be robotics or the arts or politics. It may be the soft sciences that are the ones that we really need to do this. So the third assumption I'm making for this project is that this project needs all of us, but it doesn't need all of us all the time. So the key to the success of the project, and the key to my ability to imagine 1 billion years practically, is that an individual has more than one life. Some people call it reincarnation, but what it isn't is it isn't an individual going to heaven and then staying in heaven for eternity. I don't think that's a model for the human race's survival. So I do think there's an element that I can only call reincarnation, even though I prefer not to. So those are the 3 assumptions, and that's what I'm going to develop with my metaphor of time as a tree rather than a stream or a sea. So how does my metaphor of time as a tree, how does that work? Well, very simply, I've got a trunk, which is the period which is the past. So that goes from 4.5 billion BC to 0 AD. And then I've got branches and the top of the tree, which is the future. So the future is branching with possibilities. And that's what I'm using to imagine the next 4.5 billion years until we get to the point where this metaphor is no longer adequate. This metaphor will no longer be adequate when we have completely populated the galaxy. So I'm imagining that it will take us 4.5 billion years to get to the point where we are at the center of the galaxy. So now I'm looking at time, elapsed time, in terms of distance travelable. So I've got a geometric progression in terms of distance. So I've said it will take us 1 billion years to be able to populate a point 1 light year away from where we are now. It's a depressing thought if you're in a hurry. I'm afraid it just is. Once we get to 1 light year, then the next challenge is to go 10 light years. In the billion years from 2 billion AD to 3 billion AD, we will be able to go 100 light years. We're still not anywhere near the center of the galaxy. The next 3 billion to 4 billion AD, we get 1,000 light years out. We're close, but we're not there yet. It takes the further 500 million years for us to get the next geometric progression of 10,000 light years. And once we've established a pilgrimage with that, a pilgrimage that far, then we will actually be within reach of the centre of the galaxy, and that will be our use of that time used up. So then we enter a period which I cannot begin to understand or conceptualize. But how I conceptualize these periods is based on the space, is based on my knowledge of the space that is available within those time periods. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm using a tree as the metaphor for time because it is alive. And I think that's a step forward compared with the stream or the sea. A tree is alive. It has a natural lifespan. We at the moment are all on our own. All of us are sharing the same metaphor of the same tree. So what I'm suggesting is that we can understand these billion-year periods by understanding how that will change, how we will cease to be alone. So in 1 light year, we will only ever be a single tree. And if we do come across any other civilization, any other form of civilization in the radius of 1 light year, I think we will find that it's a dead civilization, because it will either have been trapped and therefore wiped out by chance, just like the dinosaurs, or else it will have been lucky and will have got out while the going was good and be elsewhere. So in 1 light year we are alone. In the second billion years, 10 light years, when we're able to cover 10 light years, we will come across a second civilization that is still alive, and we will see that not all trees are the same tree. So I've got an oak tree, and I'm not too sure what that is, but it's meant to be a different type of tree. Go 100 light years out, and now you've got a grove of trees. You've got 2 or 3 other species to compare your species with. So it's like having different types of tree, that you can see that the characteristics of the tree. Go 1,000 light years, and now you're starting to get a wood with concentrations of trees here, concentration of trees here, and then lastly 10,000 light years, well then you've got a full-on valley, you've got a full-on terrain, which has a characteristic or characteristics. And this, to some extent, makes sense when we think of where we are, particularly, because within 1 light year from us, there is not really anything. The nearest star is 4 light years away. So there won't be any Earth-like planets anywhere within units of a light year. It's only if we could go tens of units that we would start to stand a serious chance of reaching an Earth-like planet. And we will. Increase that to 100 light years, and you're getting a serious choice. You're going to get plenty of Earth-like planets. Doesn't mean they'll all be populated, far from it. It's much more likely they won't be, but some of them will be, and multiples of them. So you can see how this works as a way to develop an understanding which is beyond the personal, individual preference, because it so happens that this fits the facts that are available to me. So in the same way as I was quite lucky that my idea worked out without me having to do a ridiculous amount of work, same here. I'm lucky that my idea works out without me having to put in huge amounts of resources I don't have. How long do trees live? Do you know? It's quite interesting. I mean, there are trees alive at the moment that we think are 5,000 years old. It's not reasonable to think that a tree doesn't have a life the same way as we have a life. If you've tended a pot plant, you might have seen what I've seen, which is that that pot plant does different things. Admittedly very slowly, but it isn't just a mechanical thing. I mean, it does express itself in a way. And when a tree lives 5,000 years, well, that's an achievement. That's admirable. A tree is more or less the longest living single thing that I know of. So there is something going on there. There is a point to that, which I think needs to be acknowledged and understood. And I think it's fascinating that when thinking about time as a whole, and indeed when thinking about the absence of time, this is one of the elements that helps us understand what time is. I've got one other observation to make while I've been thinking about this, which is that the fact that the dinosaurs got wiped out, it's thought by the impact of an asteroid which threw up selenium into the atmosphere along with the other detritus, and that selenium entered the shells of dinosaurs and it made them too hard, and so the dinosaurs weren't able to hatch their young, and so they died out. That's a colossal act of chance, and it's interesting to consider the possibility of what would have happened if that hadn't happened. And one of the things that's occurred to me is that if dinosaurs had thrived instead of being wiped out, which they were in a position to do, they were very successful. And if humanity had evolved and grown and started walking on two legs and developing tools alongside dinosaurs, then what would have been the shape of time in that scenario? Because I think that perhaps it would have greatly slowed down our progress and development as a species. If dinosaurs that were so large were as hard to kill as one imagines they were, then we would have had a far less easy ride in terms of our expansion and development, and things like farming would have been greatly slowed in terms of their development, and the building of cities would have been much more difficult if we'd have had to compete with dinosaurs for all the territories we've grown up to inhabit. At last then we come to what's really the point of this short film, which is the physics of time, and specifically the physics of a metaphor of a tree rather than a stream or a river or a sea. So let's build up the metaphor from the beginning so that we can see how it comes together and why it proves to be a more compact, more advantageous description than the normal oversimplification. The very first thing we start off with is a trunk, and so far it's exactly the same as a river, a straight line, so that's how we perceive the past. So the trunk is analogous to the past, that's our starting point. Obviously the next thing we then perceive is the future. Now, we can't say anything with 100% certainty about the future. We can't even say, I don't know, the simplest thing you might think of to say, most of the universe will be here tomorrow. The problem with that is the word here. So we know what we mean, but we're not. But that's different to being exact about it. So the advantage of branches, a branch metaphor for the future. I'm not going to draw a pretty diagram, I'm afraid. I'll be trying to just keep it simple. So the advantage of a branch metaphor is that it reflects our perception that there are many possible ways the future could develop, which are all part of the same period of time in the long run, but look to us from now as if there's endless possibility. Now the thing about a tree is that although the branches can branch as much as they like, it is bounded, and this is exactly the same with time within the universe. The universe is infinite, but that's not the same as saying it goes on forever, because the universe does have bounds. It is constrained. So these branches have to cut across each other and fold inside the space. It doesn't extend, the tree doesn't extend up higher and higher and higher forever and ever and ever. Simple enough so far. So that's one point of similarity. That's a second point of similarity. And now it starts to get useful, because the other thing about these branches, as they get finer and finer and finer as you go up the tree, is that they cut back on each other as well. They don't all face forward necessarily. And if I introduce the very latest discoveries of physics, then I would refer back to the book that Richard Feynman wrote about the quantum theory of light, where he reprinted a diagram which showed a quantum particle travelling backwards in time. So effectively you take a series of photographs, and they tell the story of what the particle's done. However, when you assemble the photographs in order, the only way that they can be interpreted is through a particle travelling backward through time. So this metaphor of a tree with branches has a double benefit, a double point of similarity with the branches metaphor, because it automatically incorporates that understanding, which is that yes, time travel, for want of a better phrase, does occur, but it occurs only right at the boundary of the universe in terms of size. So this is good, this is neat, this is effective. So let's continue. Now the other thing that trees have is they have rings. And it's the rings that tell you how old the tree is. It's not the length of the trunk. And I think this reflects what we are trying to do by understanding geological time, by understanding it not in terms of numbers, because the numbers are so astronomical as to be ungraspable. We're trying to understand it through phases. When we look at the tree, when we look at the rings of a tree, we don't assume that it spontaneously generated out of nothing from the centre of the ring. We know that didn't happen. We know the tree grew up from the starting point, which was a genuine starting point. It wasn't an explosion for no reason. It was simply the point at which time started. So we have a fourth point of similarity by looking at that more closely, which is that the tree continues below the ground. So this is one bound for the universe, the end of it. This is another bound for the universe, the start of it. Now, we know that just like a tree has roots, we know that there's a period which we assume, well, we know that there's a period between the actual start of the universe and the start of the universe that we can see, but we don't know anything more about it. And the reason for that is that it's hidden, just like the roots are hidden beneath the ground. So this corresponds to the famous cosmic microwave background in my understanding of the physics of time. So this is the starting point for a metaphor of time in pure physics terms, because you cannot see below the surface, you cannot see into the very, very, very few microseconds right at the edge of the universe. You just assume, take it on faith, that it's there. So that's cosmic microwave background equivalent to ground. So that's a fourth point of similarity in terms of physics. The final point of similarity that I want to draw is the overall shape of the tree, which is all trees. You may or may not happen to know this. All trees are fundamentally shaped from a fractal structure. So although an oak has a completely different shape to an ash or an elm, they are all fractal. They all correspond to a fractally derived shape each time. So the tree is fractal in its overall nature, whatever it looks like. And from the New Scientist website, I'm sure you can Google it. That's how I found out about it. The universe is also fractal on the largest possible scale. So when we look at the universe as a whole, we see a fractal structure to it. And the other interesting aspect of it is that the rings tell us how old the tree is, but where is the present in this metaphor? Is the present the current ring, is it that outer circle, or is the present here? There's kind of two, in my metaphor. I know this seems like a weakness of it, but actually that reflects that is one of the most important things to understand about why this is such a good metaphor, because not only does it have these points of similarity, but it also has this fundamental problem built in, which is that now seems to be in two places, and that's absolutely true of what we know about the universe. So we like to say that the universe is 13 billion years old, but there's a huge question over that when the universe is 45 billion years wide. And again, this is well established understanding, which is not explained but certainly fully described through Google. So when I'm talking about the shape of the universe in my talks and in my philosophical understanding, this is my overall understanding of time within that explanation of why the universe has the shape it has, why the universe has the characteristics it has, and why in fact there isn't any need or requirement for dark energy, dark matter, inflation, and there are things that we can understand about the universe, about the galaxy, about our solar system, which you can't understand until you know why the universe can be explained in the way that it can be explained. So I'm very pleased to have had the chance to get as far as we've got, and really I can stop there, because that's really all I wanted to say about it. Are you still here? I thought you'd be long gone by now. Did you enjoy it? Oh, well, maybe the next one will be better. I've got to lock up now. You better run along. Come on, shoo.